So this is part 2 of the Contradictions in Abrahamic religion. Now, people are taught that as I gone over in part 1, that the Hebrew text came first. But when you look at the manuscript evidence that was recovered, the earliest manuscript dates to the 3rd century BC at best, and that is the Septuagint. And it's written in Greek, not in Hebrew. Now, people suggest that it is a translation of the Hebrew text and not necessarily the original text. There is another competitor to the Septuagint called the Targum. Now, the Targum was written, that dates after the Dead Sea Scrolls, shortly after the Dead Sea Scrolls in a sense. And the Targum is really the Torah, but what it says is quite interesting. If you look up the Targum and you can go to a website and go to Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 8 to 9, it mentions 70 angels and that the Lord inherited Israel to be his nation. Now, if you go to the Septuagint, to the same 2 verses I just mentioned in the Targum, you'll get that it's saying that he divided the world according to the number of the angels. And Krios, that's what the Septuagint calls God, or well, not God, but the Lord part of it, is inheriting Israel again. And it so basically agrees with each other. And if you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, to the book of Deuteronomy, and there, instead of angels of God, it says sons of God. So we have a pantheon of deities, or angels, just like I talked about in the first video. Now, the issue is, when it comes to saying the Hebrew text came first, you have the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is only about 1,000 years old. Now, some try to suggest, well, that text kind of goes back to 2,000 years ago, but if you compare the text from 2,000 years ago to the Masoretic text from 1,000 years ago, they differ from each other in a lot of places. And even if you look at the Septuagint, you've got books called the Apocrypha that were deleted from the text and not included in the Masoretic text. Now, for those that don't know what Masoretic means, it means traditional. So it literally means traditional text. Now, the people that are mass producing the Masoretic text insist that this text is the original text and that it was given to Moses by God. So it was an oral transmission, and eventually it was written down. Now, the thing is, based on the manuscript evidence, it does not necessarily agree with traditional claims, because it appears that what we understand to be Judaism today started as another sector of the Hellenistic religion. And that was after Alexander III conquered Judea, Babylon, and Egypt in the 4th century BCE. Look that stuff up. Now, what's very interesting about this is that if you take a look at the Greek pantheon, now I'm going to make a tiny correction to the first video. I mentioned that the Greeks had a flood myth. Well, they kind of did, but it wasn't until the 1st century that it was actually written down, based on what I from what I looked into. If for some reason that's incorrect as well, I'll take a look into that in another video and talk about that in another time. But what I do notice for certain is that the text was written in Greek. The only exception to what I'm saying is, I actually forgot the name of this. Just give me just 1 second. Look up the Silver Scrolls. KH1 and KH2. That's what the 2 scrolls are called. And they're written in Paleo-Hebrew. And it's a prayer to God. It is the only thing that predates the Septuagint. The only thing, nothing else. And unless you want to include the Moabite stone, which is supposed to be about 2,800 years old, give or take. So that's also another first millennium BCE work, and early first millennium BCE work, along with the Paleo-Hebrew text in the KH1 and KH2, in those scrolls. Now, here's the thing. Some people try to suggest that this is similar to some of the prayers in the Torah. Now, the problem with that is the text does not prove in itself that the Torah was written before the Septuagint. This is just a prayer. It's not, we don't see a story in the text. We don't see a story. That's the problem. Now, with that being said, if you take a look, I talked about this in How Aries Became God, and that was the Aries parallel to the lamb in Judaism. About that, what's interesting about this is, just as I talked about how Aries became God, is that he has a son called Enelios, and later called Enelius in Rome, or in just later period. And what's interesting about this is he's a son of Aries. He's a son of Aries, remember that. But he's also another name for Aries. Look that up too. So we got a God that's his own father and his own son, just like what we see in Christianity. And if you look at the Greeks, they conquered Babylon, they conquered Egypt, and they conquered Judea. So that means they can take all this text from all these different nations and assemble it together to create the Septuagint. That is possible. If you cannot find the Hebrew scriptures prior to the Septuagint, then that would most likely be the best possibility, is that during the Hellenistic period, they combined all these different stories, and while at the same time, and this is what's interesting now, if we go back to the series I did, How Aries Became God, you will see, and do this research yourself, don't just believe what I'm saying, know what I'm saying, and you'll see what I'm saying. And that is that if you go to, was it Exodus? Yeah, Exodus 15:3, it calls God a man of war. So you have a lamb. The lamb is sacrificed. And the earliest sacrifice to this God, according to the book of Genesis, is when Abel sacrificed a lamb because he was a herdsman. But Cain didn't do that, so God was displeased. Because God, in astrological understanding, is Aries. And that's why the lamb is sacrificed. It's that simple. And if you look up what is the consensus about pre-monotheistic Judea, they're going to say that Yahweh, that's what they prefer to call him now, is that he started out as a god of war, and then later over time, he became the monotheistic creator. But what's interesting about this is that he is a son of a god called Elion. And he was the original supreme god of ancient Israel in the first millennium BCE, before the Hellenistic period at the least. He's sometimes simply called just El. E-L. Look that up too. Just type El, then space God, and then you'll find depictions of him. And if you don't want to do too much serious research, and you want a quick way to get to it, I recommend Wikipedia. Because they still have a lot of references. It's a good site. It's no website's perfect. Yes, people have problems with Wikipedia. I noticed that, but it's not a bad website. It's a pretty good website. And it's also a good website take a look at biblical manuscripts. Again, they can just give you a timeline, a nice little timeline of which one is older, which one came last, according to the amount of manuscripts that was recovered. Now, if you go through the Judaism, the whole thing with the Passover, you'll find there's layers upon layers of not only sacrifices of lambs, but also of animals in general. Now, some would argue, if you go to Christianity, for example, that what people will argue against Christianity is that it condones human sacrifice. I talked about that before, I think in a different way though. I don't remember. Anyway, and Jesus is called the Lamb of God. Now, there's one account in there where he dies during the Passover. So he is, in a sense, emulating the lamb that is sacrificed. So he's a parable for the lamb. But what's interesting is, and I said this, I'm pretty sure I said this before. If not, I'll say it here anyway. Jesus is referred to as the Lamb of God, as I just said. But what's interesting about that is, for him to be a lamb, he has to be the offspring of a lamb. So that would mean God, in astrology, is the lamb, period. That's what that would mean. And that's why lambs are primarily sacrificed to God during the Passover. Now, anyway, I'm going to cite some different verses in the text, and I recommend you compare them to the Targum, the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because when you do this, I prefer the first two verses I can think about right now is Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. Because, well, I talked about that a lot. But that's, if you research, say, someone like Marquez Smith, who wrote a book called The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, he talks extensively about Deuteronomy 32, that's chapter 32, verses 8 to 9, and how much that text changed. The reason why those two verses are very important is because, well, if those two verses aren't saying that God has a father, I don't know what will. Because these are I referred to them in the past as the biggest contradiction in the entire Abrahamic theology. Because it's not just in the Christian Old Testaments, the Hebrew text, the Greek text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Because even though they replaced angels of God, then sons of God, and then they kind of went back on angels of God in the Targum, and then you have the Samaritan. You still have the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text. They both say children of Israel instead. So they deleted the pantheon from being mentioned in Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9. However, the one thing that is still there right now, despite all these changes that occurred during the transmission of the text, is the fact that God still inherits Israel. No matter which version you go to, manuscript-wise. The older manuscripts, including the modern versions, he still inherits Israel. Now, some versions, I think it was the Good News translation, that something like that was more recent. Obviously, somebody noticed the problem with saying that he inherited, so they deleted the word inheritance from the translation in the Good News translation. I think they probably did that in a few other versions of the recent Bibles that were published. I don't remember for sure. You know what? I'm going to look this up. Just takes me just a second. Yeah, I definitely did inheritance. The Good News translation. GNT, that's the acronym for it. Look that up. Now you'll see my problem. But the good news is we have too much evidence, we have too many manuscripts, and we've got there's too much evidence in general for them to be able to hide something like this. Even in the Quran, Surah Ali Imran, chapter 3, verse 180, it says Allah's heritage is the heavens and the earth. It's actually a much longer verse, but it's there. Anyway, that's pretty much it.